This video lecture is on Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. Aristotle was a student of Plato in Athens, and he founded his own school called the Lyceum. Aristotle also was actually a tutor to Alexander the Great. So he was a very intelligent person during his time, but he was also a very reputable person, of course, serving as the tutor of Alexander the Great. But he also was someone who wrote in every single field that existed during his time. So you have physical sciences, biology, of course, metaphysics, you have ethics, politics, logic, writing on poetry, rhetoric. You have seemingly mathematics, right? All of these things, Aristotle wrote on all of these. He was a giant during his time, and his influence is immense. Aristotle did also almost suffer the same fate as Socrates. After Alexander the Great died, Aristotle's life was actually put in jeopardy, and he was threatened with those same accusations that had come to Socrates, which is corrupting the youth. Unlike Socrates, though, Aristotle did flee Athens, claiming that he would not allow Athens to sin against philosophy twice. Now, in this video lecture, we are looking at two of Aristotle's premier theoretical works of the big three, the physics, metaphysics, and then on the soul, or de anima. The physics begins an inquiry into the nature of things. The physics is one way of pursuing this question of being or existence, and the metaphysics takes up the other part of this question we'll see a bit later, or this inquiry, I should say, as well. Aristotle begins the physics by saying, since all pursuits in which there are sources or causes or elements, it is by way of our acquaintance with these that knowing and understanding come to us. And here he's speaking of the senses, that we are beings who sense. For we regard ourselves as knowing each thing whenever we are acquainted with its first causes and first beginnings, even down to its elements, right? So he's saying we come to understand something having grasped its underlying cause, that which is what makes it be what it is. It is clear that also for the knowledge of nature, one must first try to mark out what pertains to its sources. So if we are to know the question of what makes existence such that it is, we have to know what is the cause of existence, what brings things into being. On the other hand, though, the natural road is from what is more familiar and clearer to us to what is clearer and better known by nature. For it is not the same things that are well known to us and well known simply. For this reason, it is necessary to lead ourselves forward in this way, from what is less clear by nature, but clearer to us, to what is clearer and better known by nature. So what is familiar to then what is more fundamental and less familiar with ourselves, which is the underlying things of nature. But the things that are first evident and clear to us are more so the ones that are jumbled together. So the whole flux of our experience, me sitting in this chair, the voice, right, coming out of my mouth. But later the elements and beginnings become known to those who separate them out from these. Thus it is necessary to proceed from what is general to what is particular. For it is the whole that is better known by perceiving, and what is general is a kind of whole, since it embraces many things as though they were parts. Something of this same kind happens also with names in relation to their meanings, for a name too signifies some whole indistinctly, such as a circle, but the definition takes it apart into particulars. Children, too, at first address all men as father and women as mother, but later distinguish each of them. So we do not then begin our inquiry investigating into who is our father or who is our mother, but instead, what are fathers and what are mothers? In the same way, we do not inquire into the nature of human beings, and again, not necessarily in a biological sense, but in a way, the essence, the thing of which makes a human being what a human being is at all, which is what distinguishes it from, we could say, cats, from chairs, and other things. So we proceed this way then by looking at nature in general. What is it that is the originating cause of all things? What is it that makes things move is another way of thinking about this. Because it is through movement of which brings things to life. Now, we first begin looking at the things that are, right? What is most familiar to us, existence in all its myriad forms around us, the ground, the sky, human beings, activities like playing basketball and other things like that. So we're not simply interested in the what, as if we want to isolate the thing and ask, what is the chair? What is theaetetus? What is a human being? But in a way, we're asking a bit more nuanced way, the why question. So why are human beings? Why are chairs? Why is existence? Aristotle says then, to get the ball rolling here, that of the things that are, some are by nature and others through other causes. So those things that exist by nature are animals and plants, earth, wind, fire, and water, the elements that make up the world as it exists. Now, these things contain the source of their being in themselves, but not of themselves. So it is not the plant that brings itself into existence and keeps itself alive. It is the nature inside the plant itself that is the principle of cause. So it is not that I, as a human being, will myself into existence and that I will that I continue to keep on existing. There is something in me, but not of me. And that is nature. That is the soul. Now, of those things that are of other causes, these are known as artifactual things, or we could call it artificial as we more commonly understand the term. So by these other causes are things like tables, cars, anything that does not contain the source of their own making inside them. So, of course, if I make this chair isn't then going to be able to preserve itself against like the elements, right? If I just stick it out in the rain and everything. If I make this chair is not going to make other chairs come into existence. Human beings do have this principle of life within them that does allow them to persist throughout time, right? Eventually decay, of course, but also to bring into existence other human beings and, of course, artifactual things like this chair, like a telephone, like a car, and so on. Now, Aristotle undertakes a dialectical process, so he does not entirely reject his predecessors' claims. He actually takes up a part of their claims, but modifies it, right? Only keeps one part of it, leaving the rest behind. Now, it was very common to regard material as the nature of all things. These people argued that the nature of a thing is the first thing present in each of all things, which is unarranged as far as it is concerned in itself. So in the case of, we could say, a bronze statue, it would be bronze, right? That is the first thing of which, if you're going to make a bronze statue, you need the bronze. We could think of the same thing in the case of a car, right, we might need steel. In the case of a book, paper, right? Famously, as Aristotle talks about with the bed, wood. And so of someone who purported this claim, he says, an antiphon says that a sign of this, why the material is the cause of all things, that if someone were to bury a bed and what rotted had the power to put up a sprout, it would not become a bed, but wood, since what belongs to it by accident is the arrangement according to convention and art, while the thinghood, or the essence of it, is that which remains continuously, even while it is undergoing these things. So we can ask, right? Would a bed sprout to make wood? Well, according to Antiphon, and those people who say it is material that is the underlying nature of all things, it would seem yes, because the cause of the bed is wood, such that then it must give rise to other things that are made of wood. Now, science is actually in agreement with the claim that it is materials, which are the underlying cause of all things, along with, as we'll see in a bit, the efficient cause. Aristotle here thinks that's ridiculous, because a bed, although it may be made of wood, is not simply, if you just bury a bed under the ground, it is not simply going to grow into a tree. Why? Why would a bed not sprout to make more wood? If the cause is simply the material, why would that material not lead to more of its own material? In nature, for Aristotle then, when something grows, there is a to which process and not a from which. So in nature, things are not caused by what they are made out of. It's not simply the material, like of the bed being wood. It is instead to something. There's a teleological process. It is the end, right, to which it proceeds, which is the cause. So the nature of a thing cannot simply be the material of a thing from which it came. Now, each thing for Aristotle is meant, right, as it really exists when it is fully at work, as opposed to being simply potential. So if I am someone who is thinking about making a statue, the statue would only exist potentially, because I have not gone to carve it yet. This means that statue does not really exist yet. And as we'll see a bit later, even the statue couldn't entirely be fully at work. But think of a human being. Before you are born, right, you only exist potentially. You are not fully at work. So there is no underlying nature at work, right, making it possible for you to exist yet. And since nature concerns the to which of something, right, the end, the purpose as to why it exists, then again, arguing against that materialist account, if a wooden bed sprouted, it would produce some kind of tree, right, not unarranged wood, which humans produce. And of course, wood is carved up, taken from the tree, right? That is an artifactual thing where the underlying process of the tree itself has been stopped to produce wood. Now, think about, though, to go and design a bed and cut down the tree and turn it into wood, of which then I'm going to use those materials to make the bed, there's something else more than just a bunch of wood arranged in a certain pattern, right? There is a form of which it takes, which signifies a bed as opposed to being a desk made out of wood. So the opposite kind of account to which is the cause of all things is that of the form, the immaterial idea. For Aristotle, though, again, he is not going to subscribe to a fully Platonic account, and he's not going to subscribe to a fully materialist account. That for him, things will be neither without material nor determined by their material. So all things that exist do contain material. There is no being which is immaterial, but all those things that exist, even though they are material, are not determined by their material. So there is no chair which exists without being a chair, and there is no chair that exists because it is made out of wood or cloth or anything else like that. Nature is an end and a, as he calls, that for the sake of which. He says, in things that come from art, then, as in the case of a chair, a desk, a bronze statue, we make the material for the sake of the work, right? So I make that bronze statue because I want to enjoy it. I want to maybe send a signal to the city as they see this bronze statue maybe of a hero. Or I go and I make this chair because I want to rest in the chair, or I want to film these lecture videos in this chair. The sake of why it exists is for that purpose of sitting or resting in the chair. But in natural things, right, so the chair would be artifactual or artificial. In natural things, it is in being from the beginning. So that I have wood, the wood does not, therefore, because it exists, determine that it must be a chair. But for Aristotle, let's say an oak seed will become an oak tree because the nature of the thing is in it from the beginning, whereas a chair, even though it's made of wood, its existence is not in the piece of wood from the beginning, right? It's not determined by that. So if Aristotle is rejecting an entirely materialist account, if he's rejecting an entire formal account, right, an immaterial account of ideas, his account is that the nature of things is its form, but it is not form in the Platonic sense. It is form in the way of which it looks. And it looks in four ways. And this becomes known as the four causes. So each cause is equal. Nothing could exist without one of these four causes altogether. And all these four causes are just simply different ways of describing the nature of a thing. So the first cause is the material cause. It is that out of which something comes into being. So we can ask, if we want to take up the case of a chair, what is it made of? And I could say in the case of the one I'm sitting on, cloth and wood. Next is the formal cause. It is the form or the pattern of the thing, that which it is going to resemble, or in a way you could think of it being the shape, the structure, or the arrangement of the thing, such that I can identify this based on the way it looks from, let's say, a stool. Thirdly, you have the efficient cause. The efficient cause is that from which the first beginning of change or rest occurs. Or another way of putting it is the efficient cause is whatever makes a changing thing change. So we could ask of the chair, what action led its coming to be? And that could be the idea, and not simply the idea, but the skill of some person, woodworker perhaps, right, to actually fashion the chair and bring it into being. The last one is the final cause, and that is that for the sake of which. What end is it likely to serve? And in the case of the chair, sitting. Now, this explains very well artifactual beings. But what about natural beings, those things which have the source of their being in themselves? So take, for example, a tree. What is the material cause of tree? Well, it would be all the fiber, right, that makes up the tree. What is the formal cause? It is the shape of the tree such that it has the trunk, the leaves, right, such that they spread out, to capture sunlight, give shade, and so on. What is the efficient cause? It is all of the water and nutrients it takes up, and from the sun and photosynthesis, right, that brings it eventually from the seed into being a fully grown tree and continuing to exist as a tree. And what is the final cause of the tree? It is to do tree things, to grow in the sun, maybe to grow leaves, apples, right, fruit, or anything else like that, and give rise to other trees from their seeds. In the case of human beings are made out of flesh and bones and so on, right? The formal cause, right? We have arms and legs and a head and so on. Efficient cause, that would be when people have sex and give birth to someone. And the final cause is actually when we get into Aristotle's ethics. What end are human beings to serve? This is something that will distinguish, right, different kinds of natural beings, because for Aristotle, animals, right, don't have ethics. Plants don't have ethics. Human beings do, because we can ask, what is the final end of humanity? And as if you read the Nicomachean Ethics, you will know it is eudaimonia, a kind of life well lived, a flourishing. Now, something that really distinguishes Aristotle from his predecessors, his contemporaries, and those who come after him is his focus on the ultimate cause. That in investigating the nature of any one thing, one should always seek out the ultimate cause of each thing. As he says, for all these are for the sake of the end, but they differ from one another in that some are deeds and others tools. So some things can be means to an end, such that you might be taking this class because you want an education. So if I just simply want to know why you are taking this class, it can't just be to get a good grade, right? I can pursue further. Well, why do you want a good grade? To get a good education. Why do you want to get a good education? Maybe you want to eventually have some career which makes you happy, or something else like that. So another way of thinking about this is, a person builds a house because they're a builder, but they're a builder as a result of the house builder's art. That one is not simply a builder because they just woke up and decided to be a builder one day, but that there is such a role that exists being thrown into their society of the art of house building, being a carpenter, maybe an architect or whatever, such that they take that up. So again, in that case, right, it wasn't just simply their own selves that brought it into being that they were going to be a builder, but it was the existence of the art of house building. So when we talk about the nature of things, if we want to know, for example, as Socrates and Theaetetus and Theodorus were interested in the Theaetetus, what is knowledge? Right, this is another way of going about things. Of course, this question, what is knowledge? Knowledge is not a natural thing. It is it's a artifactual thing that exists slightly different from, of course, chairs and so on. And we'll have a better grasp of that in a moment when we return to the metaphysics. But when we're inquiring into the nature of things, we know that we have to look into what is the final cause of that thing, but we have to look at the motion, what brings it into existence. And as we've already touched on briefly, things exist in two ways for Aristotle, in actuality and in potentiality. If something exists in actuality, it means that thing it is fully and actively itself. It is a being at work staying itself. If it only exists in potentiality, of course, it has the capacity to be fully and actively itself, but it is not yet itself. And different things require different sources of motion. Again, the chair requires, for example, a human being to maybe set up a factory with the right capabilities to build chairs with robots, or maybe someone has to learn the skill of woodworking to construct a chair. So when we talk about motion, when we talk about how anything comes to be actual in its existence, like a human being, We are talking about, for Aristotle, motion, which is the being at work staying itself of a potency as a potency. It is that thing which allows it to continue being, which if it did not have that thing, it would not be able to continue on being what it is. He says, for each thing admits at one time of being active, at another of not being active, such that at one time I am alive, and at another time I am dead, or I did not yet exist. But for him, as he says, an example is the buildable. For the being at work must be either building or the house. So I must either be building the thing, the house being in potentiality, or the house is built, existing in actuality. But whatever the house is, the building is no longer. But it is the buildable that is being built. Necessarily, then, building is the being at work. So the potentiality for something to exist is the being at work. And when it exists in actuality, the source of it is the being at work staying itself. So potentially the structure being built in such a way, right, that it does not collapse. But building, as he says, is a certain motion. And surely the same account will exactly fit other motions that we could say, again, in the case of a cat raising a kitten, right? The mother cat raising the kitten, where it gives it milk and it helps protect it. And of course, it was the cat itself that gave birth to the kitten, right? Such that the kitten existed in potentiality. It could not have existed without the cat bringing it into existence and nurturing it. But at a certain point, it exists in actuality because that source of its own existence, the being at work staying itself, exists in actuality in that kitten. And that distinguishes, right? That distinguishes artifactual things like chairs, like clothes, like houses, from other things like plants and the universe itself, actually, for Aristotle, too. So one way, as we've seen, to inquire into the nature of things, to inquire into the essence of things, is to look at it in terms of its causality, right? And one way of thinking about this is ontology. Another way of approaching this is through metaphysics. Now, we actually have Aristotle making this distinction in the physics early on, where he says, in a way, then, nature is spoken of thus, as the first material underlying each of the things that have in themselves a source of motion and change. So as we've just been seeing, the nature of things is what allows them to come into existence and then to continue existing as it is, to persist. That's what we just looked at. But, he says, in another way, the nature of things is spoken of as the form or the look that is disclosed in speech. And that term, again, look, is something that comes from his teacher Plato. It is that thing which allows us to intelligibly distinguish one thing from other things. And this is where then metaphysics is slightly different from ontology. Aristotle begins the Metaphysics with the famous line, all human beings by nature stretch themselves out toward knowing. Or another translation, all human beings by desire, all human beings by nature desire to know. So there's something about us, there's something about, as we'll see later, the soul for Aristotle, which naturally reaches out to identify things. And it doesn't simply just reach out to identify anything, like, for example, particulars, but specifically universal things, fundamental things. Metaphysics is what Aristotle calls first philosophy. Now, the actual term metaphysics just comes because the way in which his books were arranged in an ancient library, metaphysics meant after the physics. So it was just to be taken up after the physics. But this in no way means that the physics is more fundamental to the metaphysics or any other way. In the same way with the four causes, these are four different ways of describing the nature of something. Metaphysics is just another way, along with the physics, of inquiring into the nature of things. With this different inquiry, that human beings desire to know, the one who truly desires to know is, of course, the philosopher. And the philosopher seeks first principles. So all those who have sought wisdom for Aristotle, all his predecessors and him himself as philosophers, have tried to uncover the ultimate cause of things. Right? So the physics tackles the question of why and how things come into being concerning motion and change. But we're left asking, what is it that thing which makes a being a being? Right? It is not material, but it is form. And it's not form in the Platonic sense, as we'll see a bit more clearly in a moment. But we're left asking, what exactly is form? So we are inquiring into the abstract principles of existence itself. Now, the very fact that some knowledge can be attained by demonstration, meaning deductively, makes it clear, according to Aristotle, that not all knowledge is demonstrable, and that the non-demonstrable sort must take precedence, since it must be present before demonstration can begin. That, for example, another way of explaining this is, if all knowledge is connected, what becomes most needful for us is the upward way of reasoning, from the bottom, right, from the general to the particular. A way of reasoning that travels from where we are to the things that can transform our opinions and perceptions into knowledge. So in a way, this is the starting point for that question taken up in the Theaetetus: what is knowledge? Of course, the scope of this is much broader. Now, for humans, right, experience arises from memory. Since, of course, many memories of the same thing bring to completion a kind of capacity for one kind of experience. That I, yes, perceive things. Perception plays a role for Aristotle in the course of gaining knowledge of things, but it is through the constant coming into contact with things whereby I end up coming to know something. But it's not just because I, like, let's say I go to a blacksmith and I see a blacksmith working, and because I've seen a blacksmith hammer on a sword like 10 times, I therefore know the art of blacksmithing. I learned something, but I don't yet know the art. Now that art, though, of blacksmithing is a bit different than what philosophy proper pursues. So for Aristotle, there are two different kinds of knowledge. The first kind of knowledge is what he calls practical knowledge. This is techne, or art. It's the kind of know-how that allows any kind of skilled making, like example, again, someone who can actually make a chair well. It's the kind of thing that actually doesn't exist that much anymore, because things become so mechanized. You don't really have human beings anymore that are brought up and trained for years, to be master craftsmen. But that kind of knowledge is also seen in the case of, we could say, like athletes, right? Learning how to play the game of soccer well. It is seen in the case of artists, right? The art of painting and so on. We could also give examples of like a legislator, a politician, or even a doctor. So knowledge, the knowledge that something is good or bad, for example, that we could say arsenic is harmful to humans, that comes into being, right? We come to know that whenever many conceptions from experience form one universal judgment about similar things. So if I see many people come into contact with arsenic, I can see the result of this over time. And it is through that constant encounter with these particular perceptions that allow me to form an experience, right, where I piece those together into a more general judgment. This is how, for Aristotle, the dialectical process begins between the particular and the universal. And we can here, again, think back to the discussion of the soul in the Theaetetus, which took into account perception or particulars, right, with the use of reason, right, linking the universal. So there's a difference then with experience where, as Aristotle points out, the person who perceives once, we could say, a carpenter working, of course, knows more about carpentry than someone who has never heard about or perceived the art of carpentry. But of course, one who has over many times watched carpenters work, they know more about carpentry than simply one who has just watched a carpenter work once. Now, one who has been trained in the art of carpentry knows more about carpentry, right? They have more practical knowledge than simply one who has seen carpenters work for a long time, right? They've actually been trained on it, they can demonstrate, they can teach others. But of course, one who is a master carpenter has more knowledge than simply a carpenter. And finally, for Aristotle, one who knows the foundational principles of carpentry itself, which a master carpenter might not actually know, right, which could get into the science, perhaps, and other things of carpentry itself, what makes carpentry possible, that person knows more about carpentry than even the master carpenter. Now, that last kind of knowledge is the kind of knowledge the philosopher seeks, because that is wisdom. So the nature of a philosopher, then, is to seek knowledge concerned with certain sources and causes. And these are the first principles. The lover of wisdom, though, of course, unlike the carpenter, unlike people who pursue practical, practical knowledge, they seek knowledge that is good for its own sake, and they don't consider the use value of it. So, of course, a carpenter is only going to pursue knowledge that other carpenters might have if it will be useful to the art of carpentry. A philosopher will not do that, because knowing the first principles, the causes of carpentry itself, doesn't make you a better carpenter. It's the same thing that someone who might study the science of really good athletes doesn't necessarily make them be a world-class athlete. The same kind of idea here. As Aristotle says, it is clear then that we seek it, this kind of knowledge, for no other use at all, but just as that human being is free, we say, who has his being for his own sake and not for the sake of someone else, so also do we seek it as being the only one of the kinds of knowledge that is free, since it alone is for its own sake. So of the ends of knowledge, right, there are two. There's practical knowledge, techne, right? And there's contemplative knowledge. This is concerned with abstract truth, as where we can think of practical knowledge as a more actionable truth. As he says, though, in the case of practical knowledge, even if people devoted to the active life do examine the way things are, they do not contemplate the cause in its own right, but in relation to something now. Think, for example, of the physicist. Does the physicist inquire into the nature of physics? Does the scientist ask, what is science? No. The scientist does science. The scientist inquires into the kind of truth that is produced by the skill of doing science, right, that is learned. But they don't ask about the fundamental nature of science itself. That is left for philosophers of science. In the case of contemplative knowledge, this is the kind of knowledge that is sought asking, what is science? What does science actually do? What does it seek? This is knowledge of the cause of science, and without that, the truth of it is ultimately unknown. And this means, as you'll see with all other philosophers, almost, right? Philosophy is the privileged discipline. That first principles are of a higher order than all other kinds of principles. Aristotle says, for example, fire is the hottest thing, since it is also responsible for the hotness of other things. Therefore, also, what is responsible for the being true of derivative things is more true than they are. For this reason, the sources of the things that always are must be true in the highest sense. So when each thing has a being, that too it has a truth. Another way to think about this is, if we want to think about hot things, so a car engine, right, that becomes hot to touch after being left on for such amount of time, maybe after you go for a run, your body might get a bit more hot and sweat, or maybe the sun comes out, right, and the temperature of the environment becomes hotter, right? The actual possibility of heat itself, that is what would be inquired into. What is heat? Right? And that would be responsible for the hot engine, the hot air, the hot athlete or human being, right? And in that way, then those things are more derivative of the more true things, which would be the principles of heat itself. So the four causes, then, to understand then the look of that which is nature itself, the four causes are different ways of speaking about the cause, which is form. A different kind of form, again, than what Plato meant by that. So what is meant by form, then, if it's a different kind than what is meant from Plato? Aristotle says, for there must be some nature, either one or multiple, out of which the other things come into being, while that one is preserved. So there are various arguments then about what is then the nature of things. What is that thing which Aristotle then calls the form, which is the nature of things? You have the materialists who say the nature of things is material, whereby the cause is out of which they first come into being and into which they are at last destroyed. So in the case of stone coming into being by all the other kinds of metallic objects that might make up a certain kind of rock, which then cease to exist by itself. Other maybe kinds of rocks, falling, busting it up, right? You have dualists who say the nature of things is opposite, whereby order comes out of chaos. Right? It's very different. You have Pythagoreans who say the nature of things is found in the nature of numbers, whereby numbers are imitated, in like our common existence. You have Platonists who say the nature of things is its non-sensible idea, whereby sensible things exist by way of participation. So, how does Aristotle mean form? To understand this, we have to look more closely at Plato's conception of form, and therefore essence, right? The nature of things. So you can find this in Plato's Symposium, in the Phaedrus, or in the Republic. What we find in those dialogues is known as the theory of the forms. So if I wanted to know what is the essence of a beautiful painting, right? So if I see a painting of a mountain range, and That mountain range is beautiful. Well, that mountain range in that painting is, of course, a derivative. It's only simply a representation, which, of course, fails to capture the totality of the mountain range as it exists in reality. And in that way, then, for Plato, the mountain range is necessarily more beautiful than the painting of the mountain range itself. Now, that I can still, again, right, I call the painting of the mountain range beautiful. I can therefore still call the actual mountain range in existence beautiful. What allows me to call that thing beautiful in the first place? For Plato, it is the concept of beauty. The concept of beauty would therefore be the genus of which the species of it are all those things, the particulars of beautiful things. And of course, there must be something which makes possible the concept of beauty, and that is being itself. That would be form. And these are, of course, immaterial things. And that means the immaterial things are the more real things. In the same way with the allegory of the cave, you have the shadows on the wall, which are less real representations, right, of the statues, which can be representations of actual things that exist, right, in our physical world. And what makes those possible, you had the sun, which is a representation of form itself, being itself, otherwise known as the good. So clearly, for Plato, the essence of things is immaterial, and it exists in the realm of the forms, of which all these other things that we see just take part in. So if I ask, what is the essence of a human being? The essence is not in human beings itself, right? It is in the form of human beings which exist immaterially, of which physical human beings only take part in the form of existence. And so they are derivatives of existence. Now for Aristotle, it's different. For Aristotle, the essence of things, the forms, do not exist immaterially, and they do not exist in some other realm. The essence of things is in the things themselves. So of his predecessors, right, with the Platonists, the materialists, the dualists, the Pythagoreans, and so on, for him, all these different accounts hit upon the nature of things in varying ways, but of course none of them has a sufficient account of nature itself. As he says, for some speak of the source as material, whether they set it down as one or more than one, and whether they set it up as a body or as bodiless, right, in the case of Plato, being immaterial. So these people have grasped only this sort of cause, but some others have grasped the sort from which the source of motion is, as have all those who make friendship and strife, or intellect or love a source. But about what it is for something to be, and thinghood, the essence, no one has delivered up a clear account, but those who posit the forms speak most of it. So he thinks Plato came the closest, but he still privileged one aspect of nature itself over the other ways in which it manifests. Of course, Plato, for Aristotle, privileged the formal cause over other causes. So what is essence for Aristotle? For him, forms are the thinghood of things. Forms are the essences of things. So the forms and the things that participate in them have the same form, i.e. they have something in common, which is why for Aristotle, the essence of things is in them themselves. And of course, if you remember in the physics, right, something exists in actuality when it is a being, it has a potency of a being at work staying itself. He says, if the form is not the same, there would be ambiguity. And it would be just as if someone were to call both Callias and a block of wood human being, while observing nothing at all common to them. it makes no sense to say that the essence of a human being has nothing to do with anything that makes up a human being as we understand it to be in the world. Because again, for Plato, right, the essence of human being is entirely immaterial, and all the physical attributes of a human being, those are ultimately irrelevant. For Aristotle, that can't be true. For Aristotle, the physical aspect of a human being is just as important as the form of a human being as it exists in idea, or the potentiality of it. So we have this difference then. For Plato, all beings that we perceive in the world, right, these are derivatives of the good. So if I want to say, for example, I have knowledge that Michael Phelps won a gold medal swimming. That would be of course, derivative of the true itself. But ultimately, that physical experience is irrelevant for the true itself. For Aristotle, that is just as relevant as the other parts that make possible the true. So, independent things put together by nature for him do have a source, which is called its thinghood. In other words, its essence, right? Thinghood here is the way of being that belongs to anything which has attributes, but is not an attribute of anything. It denotes a fullness of being and self-sufficiency. That would, of course, mean only natural things, only those which are capable of existing as a being itself, staying itself, can have thinghood. So ultimately for Aristotle, that means this chair I'm sitting in only has thinghood in a derivative sense, but not in a true sense. The reason, of course, is that it doesn't have a soul. It does not have that which allows it to continue on being what it is, and that which had the source of its existence in itself. So cars, clothes, right, books, these have an essence but only in a derivative sense, whereas human beings, animals, plants, the cosmos as a whole, these have thinghood in a true sense because they have a real essence, which is in themselves. The source of their being is in themselves. It is not an immaterial thing that exists in an immaterial realm, such as the realm of the forms. Now, if then it is only natural things which have thinghood in a true sense, those are things which have a soul. In one way, we've been inquiring into the nature of the soul. The word feces, spelled as phusis, right, is we might pronounce it, non-native Greek speakers, right, which is translated as physics. This is inquiring into the source of motion, right, that which animates things. Now, this was inquiring into it in general. Next, we'll look at on the soul or de anima, right, of animation in the Latin. We will be looking at specifically of those things which do have thinghood in a true sense, which do have an essence, so in not a derivative sense, like human beings, non-human animals, and plants. We'll be inquiring into that source of their motion, the soul, for Aristotle. And it is here we will also see what it is exactly that allows humans to have the capacity to come to know things at all, and how it is human beings can be philosophers and pursue first philosophy, the first principles of things, right? So we're going to come full circle here in this inquiry into nature itself. I think a good discussion question, a lot of this is very abstract. It might be hard to grasp, but I think a good discussion question we can still get from this nonetheless is for us to think about ourselves. How do we commonly think about the difference between nature, what is of nature, and what is artificial? Once we do that, then, think about, according to what Aristotle says is required for something to be natural and something to be artificial, or again, as he says, artifactual. I want to ask you this question. Are things that humans create, like artificial intelligence, genetically modified beings, and other things which continue on being with the principle of their existence within themselves, are those things natural or artifactual? Or potentially you could even disagree with the premise of my question, right, which would say artificial intelligence contains within themselves the principle of their own existence, right? So would those actually meet the qualification as being natural and not artifactual for Aristotle? And what might Aristotle think about this?